Hello, everybody. I'm McKay Coppins, a staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks for joining us for this week's edition of The Big Story, a digital event series where we talk about the latest reporting of our writers at The Atlantic. As the 2020 presidential election draws near, there are new questions about how Russia plans to interfere yet again. Our election system is still vulnerable to these attacks, and misinformation continues to play a key role in the political discourse. And all of that plays into Vladimir Putin's hands. I am joined today by my colleague, Atlantic staff writer Frank Foer, who wrote a story in the June issue about Putin's plan for our November election. He also covers big tech, among other things. Frank, welcome.
So good to be here. Thank you for doing this, McKay.
Thank you. Just quickly before we begin our discussion, I want to remind viewers that you can type your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. Please keep your questions short and on topic, and be sure to tell us where you're watching from. We'll get as many of those questions in as we can for the next 20 or 30 minutes. So let's dive in. Frank, I'm glad we have the chance to do this. You've written this great piece for the June issue, but you've also been covering Russia's interference for several years now. And more recently, I've also been writing about kind of the role disinformation plays in 2020. And just this week, we've actually seen revelations from John Bolton, the former national security advisor, that President Trump allegedly solicited help from another government, the Chinese government. So there's a lot to talk about today, and we'll get to all of that. But I actually want to start, and I don't know how you feel about listening to other people read from your stories. It always makes me a little uncomfortable, but I want to start by reading something from your piece in the June issue. You write, "The nation's vulnerabilities have widened, not narrowed, during the past 4 years. Our politics are even more raw and fractured than in 2016. Our faith in government and perhaps democracy itself is further strained. The coronavirus may meaningfully exacerbate these problems. At a minimum, the pandemic is leeching attention and resources from election defense." So I think it's easy for all of us to see that we're at a moment of extreme kind of turmoil and disillusionment in our country. How does the rising distrust in American democratic institutions play into Russia's hands?
Well, I go back and I look at how Russia evolved to the strategy that they are deploying here and have deployed in so many countries around the world. And it goes back to what Russia pioneered at home, that Russia faced, that Vladimir Putin faced an incredible amount of democratic dissent. And he pioneered certain tools to try to influence the informational ecosystem at home in Russia, and then he took those tools and he started to export them to Ukraine after he invaded in 2014. And I think that ultimately his goal is to induce the West into a state that kind of resembles what Russia experiences domestically, which is that there was an incredible amount of cynicism that Russians started to feel in response to all of the gaslighting and the misinformation that the Kremlin developed there, and that cynicism ultimately turned into apathy, where they didn't trust anybody. And the United States, as you quoted me arguing, has turned into this raucous, contentious, fractured nation. And if his goal was to induce this state of cynicism leading to apathy, it's kind of happening without really him needing to do very much. That thanks to social media, thanks to the nature of polarized media, thanks to just the breakdown of authority and trust in this country, we're just in a very fragile place. And if I think about kind of what is the nightmare scenario that happens in 2020, the nightmare is that the legitimacy of the outcome of the election is contested, because half of the country, or 40% of the country, just simply doesn't trust anything coming from an authoritative source. And if Russia decided that they wanted to influence that outcome, if they wanted to they wanted to ride on this sense of distrust. It would be so easy for them to post something on, say, to hack the Wisconsin Board of Elections website, and for just 10 or 15 minutes, post results that were fake and that were different from the actual results. And we know how the president would seize on that. We know how his allies would seize on it. And we know that it would be very, very hard to dissuade the people who, believe that there was something amiss with the election.
Yeah, it seems to me, reading your piece and reading a lot of the reporting over the past few years, you note in your piece that the Russian interference in the 2016 election is one of the most kind of studied phenomena of the past, however many decades, right? But one thing that strikes me is how adept the Russian government is, and this effort is at kind of identifying pressure points in American life to kind of push on. We're at a moment right now where there are widespread protests over police brutality and racism more generally in America. And, we actually saw in 2016, the Mueller report showed this, that the Russians looked for opportunities to exploit racial divisions and racism in their kind of broader project. So can you talk a little about that, how that works?
Yeah, well, to be fair, that is something that the Russians were pushing on. We go back to Soviet times, that if you go to the Cold War, they were well aware of our greatest flaw, and they did nothing to manufacture that flaw. That is ours, right, and we own it. And they were just pushing at a pressure point, and it's something that they just kept right on exploiting after the Cold War. So if the organizations that are kind of directing Russian interference now are the heirs to the old KGB, or they're part of this kind of grand Russian tradition of active measures, it's not really a surprise that they would continue the same sorts of themes that they continued from the last election. I think maybe more surprisingly than the focus on race was the ways in which that they've been so adept at understanding the right-wing ecosystem and understanding how to gain influence on the right. And I think that's, I'm sure that there are Cold War antecedents to that, but that seems more of a novel turn in their approach this time. But just to go to your question, which is like, how do they know? Twitter, they read Twitter and Facebook just the same sort of way that you and I do. And it's like everything is so exposed now. It doesn't take a genius to figure it out. And to be sure, there was a lot about what they did in 2016 that was incredibly ham-fisted and obvious and over the top. But just the nature of American politics right now is that we live in over the top times. And so if somebody comes in with a bad caricature of American politics, well, all of American politics is a bad caricature of American politics these days. So they blended right in. Right.
I want to ask a question here from, let's see, Jeff Langendorfer. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. He says, because the Trump administration is unlikely to make any attempt to prevent interference from Russia, presumably because Russia will be helping Trump, is there anything private actors, individual or private companies such as Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, can do to limit Russian interference or influence?
So as you noted in your introduction, I write about big tech, and historically, I'm pretty hard on big tech. I wrote a book called World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. And so when I wrote that book, and I'm very, very hard on social media in most regards. But when it comes to organized foreign influence campaigns, they saw, especially Facebook and Twitter, saw how they were blamed for the 2016 election. And I think that they've made a more determined effort to decide to avoid putting themselves in a similar position this time. So they've created kind of big security teams that that are kind of quick to investigate any sign that they have of an organized Russian attack. And so it's actually become, and they have these task forces that sit around imagining what Russian attacks will look like. And there's constant communication between the social media companies and the FBI to try to jump on any sort of human intelligence that they're receiving. So I have to say, as much as it kind of goes against my character, Facebook and Twitter have done a pretty good job of policing attacks from Russia, Iran, and China. They're not as good in dealing with the stuff that you've written about so well and reported about so extensively, which is the misinformation that would come from the Trump campaign itself or kind of domestic sources of disinformation. So that's a real failing of the social media companies.
That was one of the interesting things I found when I was reporting on this, is that, you know, there are a lot of steps that can be taken by these big social platforms to limit foreign interference campaigns. And, you know, there's a lot of support for it, right? It's much more dicey, both even from a legal standpoint, but also from, you know, just a political standpoint, to start censoring domestic political voices. And what you found in recent years is that a lot of domestic political actors have taken cues from Russia and other kind of disinformationists around the world, and then adopted them, and they're kind of covered by the First Amendment in a way that, you know, foreign governments aren't. I'm curious, you know, by the way, I think your answer just now had probably jaws dropping in Palo Alto. To have a compliment from you directed at these big tech companies. I'm curious though, what is being done at the government level, and how much is being done to kind of crack down on Russian interference? When you're talking to sources, the federal government level, DHS, whatever, how much concern is there, and does it rise to the senior levels where something could actually be done about it?
Right. So to answer that question, I gotta I think detail or outline kind of the full scope of Russian interference, and then I can answer it well. So social media is the thing that in social media campaigns, disinformation campaigns run by the Russians were the thing that got, in some ways, the most attention in the last campaign, but it was just a piece of a broader strategy that over time, it's become clear that the Russians probed the voting systems of all 50 states, that they were trying to hack board of elections and the companies that sell to board of elections, that we remember the Podesta leaks and the DNC leaks. And so that the hacking and leaking of sensitive campaign information is another piece of it. And then there's social media. So with the social media piece, yeah, the FBI and the director of national intelligence and various parts of the intelligence community are kind of keeping an eye on what the Internet Research Agency is doing. And in the 2018 election, the cybercom part of the U.S. military launched a counterstrike where they shut down the Internet Research Agency's website on election day. And so that is happening. When it comes to the state voting systems, the Department of Homeland Security has some limited ability to help the states and localities protect themselves, and so that's happening. And when it comes to hacking and leaking, again, FBI or the National Security Agency can kind of catch whatever evidence that they hear from afar about foreign actors, but there's not a lot that the U.S. government is doing to secure the campaigns themselves. And if we just step back and look at the bigger picture, this is like a clear example of a systemic threat that the United States faces that could have serious consequences for our democracy. And in the face of that threat, we've been polarized and ineffectual at the biggest picture. That when it comes to securing the voting systems, there should have been bipartisan legislation that addressed it, that came up with new federal security standards, but that never happened because, in part, Republican members of Congress, especially Mitch McConnell, were loath to reform the voting system in ways that could maybe make it easier for people to vote. In part, we're dealing with the Trump administration that at the highest level does not like to talk about Russian interference. So if there's anything systemically happening to address the problem, you could have well-meaning bureaucrats across the agencies working their tails off to improve the system. You could have people within the White House who would like to address the problem, but the president himself and his ego or whatever his relationship, like his strange case of his relationship to Vladimir Putin, it just like it detonates any systemic effort from happening.
All right. Well, this is a great segue because you're speaking to the president's motives here. We just had some pretty interesting news come out this week from former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who, in his forthcoming book, it alleges that President Trump directly solicited help from Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, in securing re-election. Now, the specific allegation doesn't have anything to do with hacking election systems or even disinformation or anything like that, but it is clear that this president, both in the example that's being cited here and also the Ukraine example, this president is somebody who does not seem especially concerned about foreign governments playing a role in our democratic process. We have a question here from BL Jack where he asked, since Trump asked China directly for help, seems like he would have asked Putin as well. What are your thoughts on that? You know, this was kind of the question at the center of the 2016 controversy. How much collusion was there? How much coordination was there? What is your sense now, 4 years later, about how much conversation there is between the president or people in his inner circle and people participating in this Russian effort?
Right. So, like, just going back to 2016, we remember that he openly asked for Russia to turn over Hillary Clinton's emails. So, which is akin to, I think, the China example that we've talked about. The Ukraine example is slightly different, but I think it does get to this fundamental element of his corruption, which is that he's just unable to ever separate his own, to see where his own political self-interest ends and kind of America's national interest begins, and he's constantly interjecting his selfish, narrow interest into kind of national policy. When it comes to whatever conversations he had with Putin, I mean, there's one problem, which is that we have these the kind of the high-profile examples of when he's had conversations with Vladimir Putin and he's kicked translators out of the room and he's engaged in this direct one-on-one conversation with him in a highly unorthodox sort of way. So we have absolutely no idea what was said in the course of those conversations, which of course doesn't mean that he asked for help, but just saying that there's this kind of big gap in our record. And you know, the question of collusion, I think, is not a straightforward one. And there's, you know, I know you have a whole lot of critics of Russiagate, as I guess it's now called, on the left and the right, who attack the alarmism with which a lot of people described collusion. And you know, to be honest and fair, like, I think that there is something to their critique where people, you know, there was a gap in the record. There was a lot of suspicious behavior that's involved, and so a lot of people kind of jumped to worst case scenarios. And I think it's, you know, we need to be careful and modest and true to the record. At the same time, like, when there is something that's suspicious, I think it's important to point out the things that are suspicious, and, you know, with all of the appropriate hedges and the like. And I think it's really worth revisiting the Mueller report, which, you know, does have, you know, is a narrative that it's filled with all sorts of suggestive incidents, which Mueller narrates, but doesn't ever kind of extract the broader pattern from, and it's not good for Trump. You know, whatever you know, even if it's not the most damning version of events, it's still suggestive of something nefarious and perhaps unwitting. But we're awaiting Volume 5 of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report about the 2016 election. And for anybody who wants a primary document to go back and look at that just is comprehensive and bipartisan and extremely well done, there are 4 volumes that have come out, and the 5th one is about collusion. And so I think I'm pretty eager to hear what they end up concluding, although there is a giant caveat about that, which is that the report needs to get approved by the Director of National Intelligence, who for the first time in the Trump administration is closer to a crony than a veteran intelligence official.
There are a bunch of questions here about kind of Russia's motives in all of this. Somebody asked, is the goal just to create discord and Trump is kind of the vehicle for that? William Brown asks, what is the level of Russian interference in our government beyond Trump? I.e., seems like a huge amount of money has poured into Kentucky and McConnell. Do you see it? Are there any concerns, I guess, this is how I'll ask it, among the sources you've talked to, that there's not just an effort to help reelect Trump, but to help, benefit other politicians? And really what's behind all of this? Is the goal just to destabilize America and America's democracy, or do they have more specific aims tied to specific parties or candidates?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm particularly interested in, I feel like gets very, very little attention, is the flow of Russian money. And we now have, since 2014, 66 different incidents of Russian money kind of flowing into foreign elections for the sake of electing, call it pro-Russian candidates, or maybe anti-NATO candidates, or anti-transatlantic candidates. And we even have from, I don't know if anybody remembers, it's recent history, but it feels so long ago, Fruman and Parnas, those two the kind of Tweedledee and Dumb Giuliani collaborators who went to Ukraine to search for dirt on Joe Biden. Well, in their indictment, it was specifically described how a Russian individual had pumped $300,000 into American elections. Now, since Citizens United, American campaign finance laws have been relaxed. The Federal Elections Commission has turned into kind of a barely functioning organization that's not investigating these sorts of abuses. So there's nobody actually monitoring the flow of foreign money into the system. So if you're Russia and you have specific objectives that you'd like to accomplish, whether it's sanctions relief or the like, it's not that hard to purchase an American politician. But just stepping back and asking, kind of, what are they about doing? Well, it's really kind of hard to definitively read Vladimir Putin's mind, but I think it's important to remember that he is a veteran of kind of the KGB and the Soviet apparatus, who bemoans the diminishment of Russia in the post-Cold War years and feels like the United States extracted humiliating concessions from Russia, and that he's a revanchist, and his goal is to make the United States feel some of the pain that Russia felt. He is a weak, he's a strong leader over a weak state, and I think that there's little that he can do to bolster his own strength, but that there's a lot that he can do to make his historic rivals weak. And I think that the weakness of American democracy and the weakness of American society is the end goal. And it was summed up for me in a Twitter handle that the Russians had queued up to go in the event that Hillary Clinton won the election. They were prepared to contest the credibility of Hillary Clinton's win, and they had a whole campaign organized. And the Twitter hashtag campaign that they had lined up was #DemocracyRIP. And so I think that really is the end goal for them.
Can you talk a little about the other kind of work that's being done? You mentioned in your piece the work of some college hackers who are basically exploring, probing our voting systems and looking for bugs and holes, vulnerabilities. is there any other kind of creative or interesting work being done at the kind of private level or kind of the non-governmental level?
Right. So the story that I described here is a guy called Jack Cable, who is a sophomore at Stanford, from Chicago, was registering for an absentee ballot, and as he was typing in his absentee ballot form online, he received an error message because he'd entered an extra quotation mark into his address. And he is a guy who participates in bug bounties for Uber and Facebook, and is paid for his way through college by helping find bugs for big corporations. And he knew that there was something wrong with this website, and he set out to fix it. And he started to look at other states, and he saw that Russians, the same vulnerabilities that the Russians exploited at the state level, were still there in 2018 and 2019. And so he started to try to get people to pay attention to it. And there's a guy at Stanford who worked for Facebook who basically recruited Jack Cable and a team of other college kids to work with the Department of Homeland Security this summer, a couple months out from the election, to try to find bugs in the system, which is both inspiring because it is creative and you're using some smart people, but it's also a bunch of college kids working at the last minute to try to protect American democracy. But there's a whole interesting industry of firms that have sprouted in the last couple of years that track disinformation, whether it's there's a social audience firm called Graphica that publishes excellent reports about disinformation. Stanford started something called the Stanford Internet Observatory that publishes excellent reports tracking disinformation. So you have a lot of sleuths who are on the case, who are trying to do these forensic reconstructions of misinformation campaigns. And like we talked about before, Facebook and Twitter have their own internal groups that are doing the same.
Well, let's go even further into the kind of personal or individual level. Alder Campos wants to know, what are ways to spot the misinformation that is spread by Russia? What should we look for? I get questions like this a lot when I'm talking or writing about disinformation, and whether it's from Russia or any domestic actor or whatever else. There's a lot of, I think, appetite from good citizens of the internet to know what are best practices. How do you identify bad information? How do you make sure that you're not inadvertently spreading disinformation? What do you usually say? What's your best advice on that subject?
Well, I'll be curious to hear what you would say, because with Russian disinformation, it's actually become fairly hard to detect it. So like I said, in 2016, it was very blatant. And one of the things that made it so obvious in 2016 was that people, the former journalists who were working in St. Petersburg for the Internet Research Agency didn't necessarily have the best mastery of English. And so there were a lot of syntactical errors in their posts. And so you could identify it in that sort of way. And there was they were all over the top. And now a lot of the Russian accounts that exist on Facebook and Twitter kind of have to hide from all the people who are searching and trying to detect them. And so they do more amplification than they do production of, they cut and paste and borrow stuff that they're seeing indigenously produced here, that they can then kind of inject into conversation, or they can further its spread. But I actually think it's relatively hard for a civilian now to identify this stuff. Like, people are always saying, I'm getting attacked by bots, but a lot of times it's hard to identify where those bots are coming from.
Yep, or even if it is a bot, there's a lot. One of the things that I tend to say when people ask me is, I'll say two things. One is that, just as a general best practice, anytime you come across a headline or a piece of content or whatever that kind of too perfectly conforms to your worldview, or like makes you feel a little too smart or prescient or whatever, like be a little suspicious of it, because there's a lot of content that's tailored to do exactly that. The other thing I'll say is that, and this is kind of the fear I always have when I'm reporting on this, and even for this conversation, it's an anxiety I have, which is that, you know, how do you make sure that people are being vigilant without crossing over to kind of abject cynicism and defeatism, right? Part of what these Russian efforts do, and I want to hear from you on this, is that they will often kind of overstate their own influence, in part to make people question, you know, everything that they see, and start to wonder, you know, anytime you see somebody who's giving you a hard time on Twitter, you just can say, oh, that's a Russian bot, or you know, somebody who's making an infuriating case for something that seems outlandish, you can just say, oh, that's the Internet Research Agency or whatever, right? How do you think about that? How do we make sure that we don't allow this kind of weaponized cynicism to do the work that these propagandists and disinformationists are trying to do?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, because I think one of the ways in which Russia succeeded beyond its expectations was that they never expected Russia itself to become a central conversation piece in American politics. And once they saw that happening, and they saw the cynicism that it would provoke, they decided to kind of pour the gasoline onto that and really stoke that line. And it's called, the experts in the field refer to it as meta hacking, where that they are meta trolling. They're trying to spread the idea that Russian influence is omnipresent, that you as Americans have no ability to shape the outcome of your election, because it's all going to be manipulated from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And so they want us to see a Russian under every bed. I mean, that's the strategy, and that makes it very, very hard for experts within the field to actually talk about it. And so they're acutely aware that we need to be defensive, we need to be able to react. But I do think that maybe the last couple questions actually are suggestive of what we shouldn't do, which is that we don't all need to become kind of vigilantes to try to police social media for Russian influence. That there's no way that we can effectually and truthfully do that, and we need to, as inert and kind of helpless as it sounds, I think we need to let the authorities be the ones who go about doing that, because Facebook and Twitter, like I said, I do believe are sincere about trying to stamp this out, and they have whole teams that do it. So you can report it to a security team at Facebook and Twitter, but I don't think that you should jump to a conclusion before they do.
We have an interesting question here from Vimalan from Chennai, India, who asks, talking about unchecked flow of Russian money into questionable foreign arenas, can you comment on the enthused efforts of the current British administration to suppress the report of Russian interference in the Brexit referendum? Looks like Putin absolutely nailed it, synchronizing his efforts on both sides of the Atlantic. Can you comment on the Russian money flowing into London too? And I would add on top of that, just to what extent is Russia doing this kind of work in other countries beyond the US?
Well, in every single Western election, it feels like since 2014, you've had some hint of Russian interference. And I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but it's really not. And so you have in France, you have Emmanuel Macron's campaign's emails leaked on the eve of their election, and the Russians simultaneously introduced a fake cache of documents into the conversation simultaneously, thereby merging the authentic information in the public's mind with the inauthentic information in the public's mind, which is a tactic I fear could be reprised in upcoming elections. In the last UK election, the prime ministerial election, Jeremy Corbyn kind of waved a bunch of secretive trade documents that were hacked that suggested that the Tory government was going to permit a U.S. private companies to come in and privatize various swaths of the National Health Service. And so it comes up over and over again, and it's clear that there were efforts to influence the outcome of Brexit. And so I do think that it's important to keep this international perspective as we think about the United States. That the United States is maybe the last place that they've begun to test some of their campaigns and strategies, but it's really just of a piece with a broader influence campaign in the West.
Not to turn this into an episode of This Is Your Life, but we have a question here from Derek Barker, who says,
"Oh my goodness.
Hi, Frank. Hi, Frank. This is your high school debate partner. Good to see you. I agree that Putin's agenda is to weaken American democracy, and our current polarization isn't helping. Curious if you are seeing any Russian activity around the coronavirus or the Black Lives Matter protests. We touched briefly on the way that Russians have kind of sought to exploit race as an issue in America. But if you have anything else to add on that, and on the coronavirus, what is kind of what is the work that Russians are doing to exploit this pandemic?
Well, first of all, so happy to hear from Derek Barker. I miss you, Derek. I know with coronavirus, it was pretty clear that they were trying to influence American perceptions about it. And there's they operate on various different vectors, and so it's not necessarily clear what their fundamental objective is. And they were much more active in Western Europe than they were in the United States with coronavirus. But it goes back to, there's a history of this with amplifying anti-vaxxer campaigns on social media, and just simply trying to kind of poke at any place where they can sow distrust of authority and create confusion and create a sense of fear. And so it's that sense of fear is the thing that they most exploit. That it creates when we're afraid, we suspend our reason, and we're susceptible to whatever goofy, dangerous theory is put in front of us.
Thank you, Derek. Yes, thank you, Derek. If there are any other former classmates of Frank, please feel free to chime in here. This is a big part of your reporting, and I want to ask you about this. Rick Glass asks, how did the Russians get into John Podestas' emails? And I would add, to what extent, how big a part of Russian interference was that? That often seems to get lost in the debate over kind of Russian collusion and how much influence did Russians really have? Talk a little about getting into the Podesta emails. You actually spoke to John Podesta over the course of your reporting.
Yeah, well, in the 2016 election, I think that the leak that had the biggest impact was actually the leak of DNC emails in the first day of on the eve of the Democratic National Convention, because that actually prevented the party from coalescing as it was in the middle of its big unity pageant. And so I think that actually had a meaningful impact on the campaign. Remember, the Podesta emails were leaked in the aftermath of the Access Hollywood video. And so they were done to try to redirect conversation. And I don't know if we can, there's no plausible metric that we can use to kind of see exactly the impact that those had on the campaign. I don't know if they were decisive or not. I kind of am skeptical that they were that impactful. But the reason I wanted to meet with John Podesta and to revisit that episode was because there's an intangible cost to getting hacked. And so Podesta was hacked in the most basic spear phishing attack, where there was a fake email that mimicked a security email spoofed a security email from Google that told him that he'd been breached, told him it was imperative to change his password. And Podesta famously asked the IT person in the Clinton campaign to assess whether he should do this or not. And he got a garbled answer back and ended up doing that. But the reason I revisited the Podesta incident is that October, 7th, I can't remember the day that the Clinton, the Access Hollywood and WikiLeaks happened was, within 30 days of the campaign ending. And there's the intangible cost is that if you're running a campaign, you have no idea what is going to surface from your emails that might have some sort of impact. And so you become panicked and paranoid, and you have to convene a team to go through thousands of emails and to read those very closely. And you have to respond to all the press stories that were generated by them. Because if you remember, what WikiLeaks did was that they didn't just put out kind of one cache of leaks. They tried to unfurl it over the course of that month, which meant that the Clinton campaign was constantly on the defensive. And so that much we know. But there was this personal component to me that was fascinating, which is that when your information is on the internet, suddenly all sorts of fraudsters descend on you. And so people started to apply for Social Security benefits and credit cards in John Podestas' name. And so we had to deal with that. He collected all sorts of miles on the Vamoose bus that goes from Chinatown in DC to New York, where Clinton headquarters were. And he loved taking it, and he compiled 1 million loyalty points on that. And somebody came in and they stole all of his Vamoose miles, which was actually enraging to him. And so he just spent a lot of time distracted, even though he claims he was stoically going about doing the work of the campaign. His mind was off the ball, I think. And this was a campaign that made a couple of strategic mistakes at the very end. They didn't send resources to the right places. And so I think it's legitimate to ask the question whether the Russian hack, at the very least, was kind of an unwelcome and destructive distraction for the Clinton campaign.
We are going to leave it there. I do want to just note a question from Scott Duncan, who says, you both do excellent work on this topic, and I appreciate it, but McKay's background is way better than Frank's. How do you account for the disparity in the rooms from which you are doing the Zoom call? I just want Frank to just ponder that. We appreciate everybody doing this. Frank, thank you for joining this conversation. We hope you will all subscribe to our journalism at theatlantic.com/subscribe. And we also hope that you'll join us for our upcoming event cast. Next week, the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, will talk with our own Anne Applebaum about her latest cover story for the magazine on why the Republican Party has abandoned their principles in support of Trump. We'll send you more details via email, so stay tuned for that, and see you on theatlantic.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, McKay.